Our husbands were hung last month. 9 widows on the stolen ranch he was sold by mistake. The deed was folded into eighths, soft as cloth from being carried, and it lied to me twice before I ever saw the ranch. Lied about the acreage. Lied about there being nobody living on it. I read it again by lamplight in a hotel room in Cheyenne, thumb running the crease, like reading it slower would make it truer. 320 acres, a house, a well, a barn, clear title, sold by a man named Garrity who I'd paid in good coin and who, I would later learn, never owned an inch of it. He'd sold the same paper to 2 other fools before me and lit out for Nebraska with all our money sewed into his coat lining. I didn't know that yet. All I knew, riding in 2 days later with my 1 horse, and my 1 rifle, and my whole life packed into saddlebags that didn't weigh enough to call a life, was that smoke was coming up from a chimney that was supposed to be mine and empty. I sat the horse at the tree line a good while before I went down. Man my age, you learn to sit still and watch before you do anything else. 38 years old, and most of them spent on a trail or under a wagon or burying somebody. And the one thing the trail teaches you that's worth keeping is patience costs nothing and moving wrong costs everything. 9 women came out onto that porch like they drilled for it. I want to say that plain because it's the truest thing about that whole first hour. They didn't scatter. They didn't scream. They came out in a line, oldest in front, and the oldest one was already holding a shotgun like she'd been born holding it, like it was just another limb God had given her late, and she said, loud enough to carry but not raised, "That's far enough." I stopped far enough. "This is Hargrove land," she said. "Has been since the spring. You're trespassing." "I bought it," I said. "Bill of sale, clear title. Man named Garrity sold it to me in Cheyenne 3 days back." Something moved through that line of women like wind moving through wheat. Not surprise exactly. More like a thing they'd been bracing for finally landing. "Garrity's a thief," the oldest one said. "He sold us this land in March, same paper probably, same lies." I didn't call her a liar. I'll tell you why later, but it wasn't manners, not at first. It was that I looked past her, past the shotgun, and counted heads on that porch, and there were 9 women and not 1 man in sight, and not 1 boy old enough to carry water without spilling half of it. And I understood before anybody told me a single fact what kind of arithmetic had happened on this land. Her name was Inez Hargrove. I'd learned that within the hour, though it took longer to learn. She'd kept the name Hargrove not because it was her husband's, but because it was the only thing she had left that nobody could take off her with paper. She let me ride in. Not because she trusted me. She told me later she didn't trust me for a solid 2 months. Trusted me the way you trust a storm cloud, which is to say you watch it close and you don't turn your back. But because I got down off my horse before she asked me to, and I held my rifle out by the barrel, stock first, and laid it across my own saddle where she could see both my hands were empty. A man who keeps his gun in his hand when there's 9 of them, and one of him is either stupid or planning something. I wasn't stupid, far as I knew, and God knows I wasn't planning anything beyond figuring out how I'd been robbed. We sat at a table that 16 hands had built. I counted the joints later, rough and overbuilt the way people build when they've got more grief than lumber sense. And I told them my piece, and Inez told me hers, and by the time the lamp needed trimming, we had the shape of it. Their husbands had ridden together. 9 men, most of them brothers or cousins or men who'd married into the same loose family, the way frontier families stitched themselves together out of necessity more than blood. They'd taken a cattle contract that turned out to be a rustling operation run by a rancher 2 valleys over named Coil Webb. And whether they knew that going in or got tricked into it, same as everybody gets tricked into everything out here, I never did get the full truth, because the 9 of them were caught with Webb's stolen herd and a federal marshal who didn't care much for explanations. And they were hung off the same crossbeam at a railhead 3 counties south. All 9, inside of 1 afternoon. This past spring, 9 widows. 1 ranch they'd bought with what was left, sold to them by the same Garrity who'd later sell it to me. Squatting on land with no deed that would hold up, because Garrity's paper wasn't worth the cotton it was printed on. And they knew that, and they dug in anyway because where else does a woman go with nothing and no name that isn't already a scandal? I want to tell you what that table looked like, because I think about it more than I think about my own wedding, which I'll get to. 9 women of every shape life makes a woman. One of them couldn't have been 20, swollen near to term with a baby whose father she'd buried 2 months back. And one of them was past 60 with hands like dried rope. and the rest spread out between, and every one of them had the same look, which wasn't sadness exactly. Sadness is soft, and this wasn't soft. This was the look of people who have already lost the worst thing and are now simply deciding what they're willing to lose next. I had two choices that I could see. Pull my paper, ride to the county seat, get a judge to throw them off land I'd paid for fair, which I had every right to do and not 1 ounce of pleasure in. Or do the other thing. I didn't decide that night. I want to be honest about that, because the story gets told smoother than it happened, always does. I rode out the next morning saying I'd be back with the law, and Inez stood on the porch and didn't try to stop me and didn't beg, just said, "Do what you need to do," in a voice so flat it took the starch clean out of whatever certainty I'd ridden in with. I got 2 miles down the trail and stopped my horse in the middle of the road, for no reason I could name, and sat there a long time. Here's the thing nobody tells you about being 38 and alone. I'd had a wife once, young, both of us young, and she died of a fever in the second winter, before we'd had time to make any children or any real history together, just 2 years of trying. And I'd spent the dozen years since then being useful to other people's outfits, hiring my back and my rifle and my good sense to men building things I had no stake in, because it's easier to be needed a little by a lot of people than needed a lot by nobody. I had no land. I had no name worth protecting. I had $400 and a horse and a rifle and a deed that turned out to be a lie, and somewhere in those 2 miles I understood that the deed wasn't the only thing that had turned out to be worth less than I thought. So had the life I'd been building around being nobody's problem. I turned the horse around. I told Inez I wasn't going to the law. I told her, and this part I do remember word for word because I'd practiced it the whole ride back like a fool, that the paper said the land was mine, and the work said the land was theirs, and the only honest thing to do with 2 true claims was put them together instead of fighting over which one was truer. She looked at me a long while. "And what do you want," she said, "for putting them together?" "Don't know yet," I said, which was true. I didn't know yet that what I wanted was something nobody had offered me in 12 years, which was a reason to come back to the same patch of dirt every night of my life. That's how I came to live on the Hargrove Ranch, in the bunkhouse, separate from the main house where the 9 of them slept stacked 2 and 3 to a room, and how the spring and summer that followed became the only months of my life I'd call full without having to stretch the word to fit. I want to tell this part out of order, because that's how it sits in me, not as a straight line, but as pieces that come up depending on what I'm doing with my hands when I think of it. There's the piece where Coyle Webb rode up with 4 men in July, having heard somehow, "These things travel, dust to dust, faster than telegraph out here," that the widow's ranch had a man on it now, and Webb wanted to know by what right I was protecting women whose husbands had stolen his cattle. Never mind that it was his cattle scheme that got them hung in the first place. I stood on that porch with my rifle held the way a man holds a rifle when he means to use it, but hasn't decided yet. And behind me, not in front, because I'd told them plain I wasn't going to be the only thing standing between this family and trouble, stood Inez with the shotgun and 2 of the younger ones with rifles their dead husbands had left behind. And Webb looked at that, and did the arithmetic same as I had on the first day, and decided 4 men against a man with nothing left to lose, and 4 armed widows with even less wasn't a fight worth the math, and he rode off, and didn't come back that year. There's the piece where the youngest one, Mercy, had her baby in October, and I rode for the doctor through a sleet that cut my face raw and got back too late, the baby already born, but I got back in time to stand in the doorway while Inez handed me a boy wrapped in a shirt that had belonged to his hanged father, and Mercy looked up at me from the bed, exhausted past speaking, and just nodded once, like she was telling me something I'd earned the right to be told. I held that baby for about 4 minutes before somebody took him back to nurse, and in those 4 minutes I understood something about being needed that no contract I'd ever signed for any outfit had taught me. There's the piece, and this is the one I circle back to most, lying awake, where Inez came to the bunkhouse in November, not for anything improper, just to bring coffee because the well pump had frozen, and I'd been out 2 hours fixing it with hands that had stopped feeling like my own hands. She set the cup down, and instead of leaving right off, the way she usually did, she sat on the edge of the cot across from mine and watched me drink it. "You could have left in July," she said. "When Webb rode up, most men would have decided 9 widows and their trouble wasn't worth a bullet." "I bought the land," I said, which was the truth but not the whole truth. You didn't buy us, she said. Nobody bought us. We're not part of the deed. I didn't have an answer ready, so I didn't say anything, which by then she'd learned was usually when I had the most to say. I watched you with that baby, she said. 4 minutes you held him like he weighed something. Most men hold a baby like it's made of something that'll break if they breathe wrong. You held him like he was already somebody. He is somebody, I said. That's what I mean, she said. She didn't kiss me that night. I want to be clear about that because it would be easy to round the story off there. Neat. And it wasn't neat. It took until the deep cold of January, after I'd spent 3 weeks half frozen myself hauling feed through a blizzard that killed 11 head of cattle on the next ranch over and not one of ours, because I hadn't slept proper in those 3 weeks for checking the herd. And I came in one night so done and I couldn't get my own boots off. And Inez knelt down in front of me in that cold kitchen and pulled them off herself, one and then the other, and didn't say a word about it being beneath her or beneath me. Just did it the way you do a thing that needs doing for somebody who's earned having it done for him. Then she looked up at me, still kneeling, my boots in her 2 hands, and said, I've buried one husband already, and I swore I'd never let myself need a man again bad enough that losing him would put me back where that put me. She set the boots down careful, like they mattered. But I need you. I've needed you since July, and I've been too proud and too scared to say it plain. So I'm saying it plain now because you've never once asked me to, which is the only reason I trust it. I'd like to tell you I said something worth remembering back. I didn't. I just put my hand on the side of her face, rough hand, cracked from the cold, and she leaned into it like she'd been waiting a long while for somewhere warm enough to put her cheek. And that was the whole of it. That was the moment. No fireworks. Just 2 tired people in a cold kitchen finally putting down something heavy they'd both been carrying alone. We were married in March, a year almost to the day from when I'd sat that horse at the tree line counting heads on a porch I had no right to be looking at. Town judge came out, because none of us much wanted to make the trip in, and all 9 women stood in that front room, and Mercy's boy was walking by then, hanging onto Inez's skirt, and somebody had found enough wildflowers in the late frost to make it look like something other than what it mostly was, which was 9 widows and 1 man and a deed that finally said what was true on the inside of it. I never went to a judge about the land, never had to. Turned out, and this took the better part of that first year to untangle, a deputy from Cheyenne finally running Garrity down in Nebraska, and finding 3 separate bills of sale for the same 320 acres, mine and theirs, and a third one sold to a man who never showed up to claim it at all. Turned out the actual title, the one that traced back through county records that predated all of Garrity's lies, belonged to nobody living, an estate gone unclaimed since before the war. The county let it go to whoever could show continuous occupation and improvement, which by then was the lot of us, 9 widows and a man who'd ridden in by mistake and stayed on purpose, and the deed they finally cut had 10 names on it instead of 1. I keep that second deed folded in the same drawer as the first, the false one from Garrity, side by side. Not for spite. Just so I remember on the nights I need reminding that the lie was what brought me to the truth, and that the truest thing I own isn't 320 acres at all. It's a woman who watched a stranger ride up with a piece of paper that should have made her his enemy, and decided, slow and careful the way she decided everything, that a man's worth isn't in what he holds title to. It's in what he's willing to protect without ever once asking what he gets to keep. I keep the boots by the door where she pulled them off me that January night. Worn through twice since, resoled twice since, never thrown out. Some nights I look at them longer than a grown man ought to look at a pair of boots, and I don't feel foolish about it at all.